Not too shortly after my Baldur's Gate 3 main review released, I took to the comments on YouTube, Reddit, and elsewhere and noticed a trend. A lot of veterans who had played the game throughout its early access period wanted specific and more testing of the game's third act, which apparently had some very intense performance issues that were not there in the first and second acts. Sure, there was a good amount of hyperbole and vitriol in some of these comments too, but the more eloquently phrased ones definitely got me thinking. It would not be the first time that a long RPG ran worse the longer the player progressed into it. Who could forget how Bethesda's games like Skyrim performed on PS3? But getting to experience endgame content that maybe takes 50 hours or more of play while getting a review out on time is not exactly easy. But thanks to the Twitter user Darkness FX, who offered me their save and some handy hints, I've been able to go back into the game with a 99-hour save and get some hard data about the performance in the game's third act, which I will talk about today in this video. So while I just referenced Skyrim on PS3, what appears to be happening in BG3's third act is very different, most likely. In Skyrim on PS3, it was a memory issue. For the third act in this game, the issue is more about the density of objects and AI. Baldur's Gate 3's third act takes place in Baldur's Gate, a large city in the series lore, and as such, it has a lot of non-player characters in it, and a good deal more than the game's first and second acts. The issues caused by this in the third act were actually mirrored in my initial review, how I noted a mid-spec PC in those areas laden with NPCs had lower performance and poor frame times that I hoped the developers would clean up via patching if possible. The issues that I'm showing on the Ryzen 5 3600 here in DX11 and in Vulcan on the coastside town of the first act are amplified in the third act by a great degree, as there's many more visible on-screen NPCs in that act. Just running through the city from one point of interest to another shows off how many more NPCs there are than in my first captures from the first act. So naturally, I actually think it makes a lot of sense for this third act to be heavier than anything seen in the first or second acts. There's a dramatic increase in the amount of NPCs, which then subsequently makes the game more CPU limited on many PCs out there, if not all of them. And I also think it starts to then amplify other issues that the game already had technically due to the CPU limitedness, but were otherwise not so visible actually in the previous chapters. One of the quirks of this heavier CPU performance in Act 3 is that it makes movement in the game a lot more jittery. Check this out. Here's me just sitting still with a frame rate of around 90 FPS when CPU limited under DX11 on a Core i9-12900K, which is of course a monster CPU. Now watch me start moving the character around in mini circles. Due to the movement, the game starts to run 20% worse on average while CPU limited, even though the view and the amount of objects on screen is essentially the exact same. But movement appears to be causing frame times and FPS spikes in a bad way. That is pretty poor, honestly, and it's going to scale worse on even lower end CPUs. As to why moving the camera and the character ever so slightly here in the third act specifically shows a specific performance drop, well, that's hard to say. If I were to guess, I would imagine movement changes something about AI navigation needing to be updated, which then incurs a cost, but it's hard to know for certain. Another issue found in the third act is in camera transitions from cutscenes or conversations. In the third act, a conversation like this one will have much larger frame time stutters in it and massive drops when the camera changes angles to enter a conversation. The size of stutters going into conversations in previous acts is definitely not as large. If I were to guess as to why, I would imagine the greater CPU burden in these areas in general in the third act is amplifying issues that the game already had that were CPU limited, like transitioning into cutscenes. So transitions into cutscenes and these pauses that associated with them are now more visible and longer and worse in the third act. But the biggest difference in the third act is found in frame health, as I like to call it. Going back to my Act 1 recordings, let me show you what I mean. On a Ryzen 5 3600, when running around that town, you'll see areas where the frame length increases from frame to frame, and you get a higher variance of frame length. When the frame time line is jittery and stuttery, as we see here, I call that bad frame health. When it's more smooth and regular, I would say the game has good frame health. The third act of Baldur's Gate 3 in the city tends to show bad frame health, just as you can see here in this performance recording of the game in DX11 mode when running around the area on a 12900K. The frame health is not too great, with a greater variance in frame times. Compounding on this are the earthquakes you can see in the city, which coincide with large spikes in the frame time, which look like bigger stutters on screen visually. As it is right now though, I'm showing you one of the better case scenarios with the 12900K and the DX11 API. You can actually get much worse performance. For one, you could run the game under Vulkan. Much like I showed in the game's Act 1 on AMD and Nvidia hardware, Vulkan runs these NPC-laden areas of the game worse on average than DX11. In this test scene, we see Vulkan running on average 10% worse. That is a sizable chunk of performance for running a more modern API, and you'll definitely notice that difference in frame rates when the frame rates are already this low on a Core i9-12900K, just hugging above 60 FPS essentially. As I said though, the 12900K is definitely not the worst case CPU. You could have an older, less high-end CPU like a Ryzen 5 3600 when, while CPU limited, we can see that it has rather disastrous performance. If the 50% cut on frame rate next to the 12900K in the same scenario was not bad enough, well then look at its frame time health, and that tips it over the edge. While the 12900K definitely has some frame time spikes and jitteriness to it, the Ryzen 5 3600 is much worse off, with nearly every other rendered frame on the Ryzen 5 3600 showing a great variance in length, and this is visible to the naked eye while playing the game. It may run around 30 FPS on average at times, but it would never look like a 30 FPS that is smooth, as the frame variance is too high. G-Sync or FreeSync monitors cannot deal with such frame time variance, and it would also look jittery there. And guess what? It can get even worse than this. What if you are a sorcerer in Act 3 and use a number of summoned creatures? As you can see here, I'm raising an army of the undead to follow my party around. And when I do this while running through the city, we can see how it further decreases the performance down by 10%. But notice the frame time graph, how it is more erratic with all the summons there on the right. This isn't hugely problematic on the 12900K, but you can see how the frame times in the frame time graph with the AI summons start to show a spikier, steep hill and valley-like presentation. Essentially, with all the AI summons around, we can see that there's one frame that is much more expensive periodically than all the others on the CPU, and this happens in an up-down motion. What is more expensive every couple frames? Well, maybe it's pathfinding, maybe it's an AI update, maybe it's an animation update. It's hard to know, of course, but on an older mid-range chip like the Ryzen 5 3600, this AI update is amplified with all the summons going around, and it's even more disastrous. In that same scene with the AI summons on that AMD chip, we can see how all the AI summons will reduce the average frame rate by just only 6%. But take a look at the frame time graph. It was rocky before, but now it's positively mountainous. Every 300 milliseconds or so, there's a colossal increase in frame time of usually around 50%. This leads to jerky movement, so the game will never ever look smooth. Honestly, on a Zen 2 chip, this third act in general plays rather disastrously. Just moving around with the summons in a completely empty area in the dungeon, for example, shows big frame time lurches and stutters, which don't look good at all and really impact playability. So to answer my question at the beginning of this video, yes, the game's third act runs worse than the first and second acts. I think you can explain it though. There's just so much more AI on screen now, which then appears to amplify other CPU limited issues. But is this performance justified, and can you do anything about it? Regarding the latter question, I don't think there's much you can do. Even at the absolute lowest settings, you can see how the average performance is lifted by just around 14% on a Ryzen 5 3600. The frame times are a bit less erratic when doing so, but those earthquakes still cause big frame time spikes, and of course the performance is rather low, and you're seeing much worse graphical presentation due to the LOD hits. What about Vulkan on this low-end CPU? Yeah, this doesn't do anything, just like on the Core i9-12900K, where we can see Vulkan running around 7% slower on average on a Ryzen 5 3600 in the Nvidia driver compared to the DX11 code path, and a similar level of performance degradation there, even while running on an AMD GPU. Just like in my original video here, we can also see that frame times with Vulkan are just as unsteady as they are with DX11. So Vulkan isn't really causing an improvement here, and in fact, it's a detriment. What about a 30 FPS cap? Well, the game's own 30 FPS cap with VSync on does not have proper frame pacing, so I would say avoid it if you use VSync. But even when using NVIDIA's half refresh adaptive sync as found in the driver, you can see some moments of rising spiky frame times above 33.3 milliseconds due to the game's CPU limited characteristics on the Ryzen 5 3600. It is more consistent visually, but the larger frame time spikes that occur are visually intrusive. So you can mitigate the CPU issues in this third act with a frame rate cap, but that isn't an ideal situation. Not at all. Now to come back to my first question about whether or not this performance is justified in the third act, and can it maybe be fixed? To answer this, I think we can look at how the performance scales with the amount of cores and threads. When looking at a Core i9-12900K, we see some interesting data. As you can see here, the scaling across many cores and threads in NBC-laden areas of the game is far from ideal. The best performing combination is actually 8 cores without hyperthreading on, which isn't good. Using the 6-core result as a base for performance, we can see how 8 P-cores without HT runs around 4% better than that, and the full Core i9-12900K with E-cores and hyperthreading enabled runs just about 2% better than the 6-core result, even though it's more than doubling the amount of threads and cores available to the game. The surprise, of course, is that the worst performer is the 8 P-cores with hyperthreading, which runs about 6% slower. And yes, hyperthreading running worse is a fully repeatable data point, and I triple checked that. The numbers across 6 cores and the full 12900K shows us that after 6 cores, the game does not scale well in performance, and it's not utilizing extra threads to meaningfully improve the frame rate and frame time experience. In fact, with hyperthreading on, the game is running worse on this CPU. As a reminder, good scaling will look like this, as we see in Cyberpunk 2077. Yes, this is a much larger game studio, of course, with a lot more money invested into the game, but this is the type of scaling we should prefer to see on many threaded machines. As I see it, the scaling shows me that this game needs more work in the Act 3 environment. As an addendum to my initial review, I would say the game needs to improve the performance on many thread and cored machines by utilizing many more cores and threads to improve the fluidity of the player experience in these CPU limited scenarios. Another improvement I would say is to improve the situation around stutters that become more visible in Act 3. The things like earthquakes and camera positional changes, or just moving the camera at times, should not be causing such visible increases in frame time, especially on large CPUs. And like I said in my original review as well, Vulkan is still such a question mark here in Baldur's Gate 3. Its purpose seems void if it does not meaningfully help CPU performance when you need it the most. And I imagine a good and performant Vulkan implementation could be the basis for helping out CPU limited issues in Act 3 that I just detailed in the course of this video. And with that being said, I've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the Act 3 performance in Baldur's Gate 3 and how it could possibly improve. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support DF on Patreon to get years of our content in high quality for download. Comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.